The Zhilari command station loomed like an inverted thorn over the desolate surface of Corrales IV, its harsh metallic angles casting a stark shadow across miles of barren rock. Inside, rows of control panels pulsed with ethereal light, reflecting in the many eyes of First Commander Bralvis as he awaited his audience. Bralvis's frilled neck scales twitched, betraying a deep unease. Reports from the front lines were already streaming in a sign that their efforts were being thwarted by the unexpected presence of humans. Bralvis knew what was coming. Every species in the galaxy had at least one horror story about crossing paths with the peculiar primates from Terra. Still, he clung to a shred of optimism. His subordinate, Officer Tia Lin, spoke up, his voice a mix of apprehension and determination. The human they call Captain Elias Forde has been spotted at the forward encampment. Describe him, Bralvis demanded. His assets, his known weaknesses. Ta Lin's mandibles clacked nervously. He walks unarmored into the fray, sir. Reports state he carried nothing but a bag of snacks and a board marked with intricate lines. Aboard, Bralvis narrowed all 6 eyes. Is it a control interface? Some kind of disruption tech? We're uncertain, Ta Lin admitted. The board was used to plan troop movements while he shared his food. Most distressing, our operatives report that his troops found this activity deeply encouraging. Bralvis's scales bristled. Shared food is morale, typical human absurdity. Bring him to me. The forward encampment was a desperate scene. Hardened Alliance troops dug into hastily erected trenches as artillery fire cracked the air and splintered rock into shrapnel. In the center of it all, amidst a frenzied mix of barked orders and laser fire, Captain Elias Forde stood calmly. He had one boot planted on a crate, a hand extended toward a holographic battle map projected from his wristband. Okay, so they've got overwhelming numbers, Elias said to his assembled lieutenants. His tone was light, almost conversational. Classic strategy would say we hunker down or make a desperate charge, right? But classic strategy didn't take my emergency peanut butter rations into account. There was a pause as his officers looked at one another, confusion playing across their faces. Captain Attrition soldier with mottled blue skin ventured, how will peanut butter win the battle? Elias tapped the map. Simple. We'll use it to lure the claw beasts from the eastern mountains directly into their artillery position. Those things love peanut butter. Meanwhile, their shells won't discriminate between us and them. Chaos ensues. A Murian officer with chitinous armor let out a buzzing sound that translated roughly as bewilderment. You're saying we weaponize snack food? Essentially, Elias grinned. Oh, and while that's happening, we'll rig up some distractions to make it seem like we've got reinforcements. This way, they'll hesitate. Another officer raised an appendage. Wouldn't a display of reinforcement strength normally require more firepower? Not necessarily, Elias replied. You see, I'm excellent at ventriloquism. The plan worked beyond anyone's expectations, and that fact alone terrified the Zhilari who survived. The claw beasts charged into the thick of battle, distracted by tantalizing blobs of peanut butter, scattering troops, vehicles, and munitions. As the Zhilari desperately regrouped, fake reinforcements arrived thanks to Elias mimicking commands, redirecting attention with ventriloquism, and employing holographic projections of incoming reinforcements. The confusion proved decisive. One Zhilari operative was later heard muttering in disbelief, "They do not fight wars. They craft mind-warping theater." Bralvis watched a recording of the battle, mandibles grinding with frustration. This human destabilizes entire theaters of war with parlor tricks and snacks. We will confront him directly. The War Council convened, plotting an ambush. Their calculations showed only one likely route for a human-led resupply mission, and there they would end this madness. Their preparations involved hundreds of combat-ready troops, specialized anti-human suppressors, and biochemical agents attuned to human biology. The convoy approached as predicted. Hover barges laden with supplies and human medics formed a vulnerable target. The ambush sprang with precise timing traps detonating, cutting off retreat paths and ensuring that Elias and his troops were surrounded. Bralvis watched as Captain Elias Forde appeared amidst the chaos, raising both hands as though surrendering. "You got us." Impressive ambush, really, he took a step forward. "Hold your ground," Bralvis barked. Every weapon in the Zhilari arsenal trained on the human. you will explain how you keep defying logic itself. Elias smiled a smile that unsettled Bralvis more than any battle. Of course. Let me show you a trick first. Elias reached into a pocket and pulled out a small cylinder. The Zhilari troops tensed, preparing for an explosion or energy pulse. But instead, Elias clicked a button and music, a jovial, utterly incongruous tune, blared into the battlefield. Disorienting your enemy, Elias explained, can be done many ways. Within moments, Alliance reinforcements, forewarned by Elias's covert signals, struck the Zhilari lines. The attack was brief and decisive. Bralvis found himself face to face with Elias as the human extended his hand. Peanut. What is your purpose in warfare? Bralvis sputtered, incredulity overtaking fear. To end it. Thoroughly, Elias leaned in. We don't just win wars, we ensure you never, ever want to start one with us again. And from there, things escalated. The Zhilari and their allies learned that humans weren't interested in mere domination. Each new encounter introduced another level of psychological warfare. They tried orbital bombardments only for Elias to devise reflective orbital mirrors that scattered their own shots across their fleets. They unleashed mind control gases only to discover human counterintelligence had developed anti-boredom filters that turned forced hallucinations into whimsical, laughable dreams. On one occasion, Elias and his team infiltrated the enemy's high command using little more than stolen uniforms, absurd confidence, and a concoction known as jungle juice that made even the fiercest Zhilari guards susceptible to charm and dance competitions. Bralvis sat in the dim light of the Zhilari command room, talons tapping nervously on the console. Reports from every front indicated the same thing: humans had no interest in simply winning engagements. Each encounter they engineered eroded morale, shattered cohesion, and instilled a visceral dread of meeting humans on the battlefield again. He leaned in closer to Ta Lin. Explain to me how they convinced our elite commando unit to defect. Ta Lin's mandibles clattered, betraying his anxiety. The human Captain Elias offered them a team-building exercise, sir. Apparently they bonded over high-stakes, competitive games involving throwing objects at colored targets. By the end, our commandos were thoroughly convinced they preferred this to war. They defected because of a recreational game, Bralvis rasped, 6 eyes narrowing. Humans call it dodgeball, Ta Lin said, shrinking under Bralvis's incredulous gaze. They said it strengthened their reflexes, sir. Bralvis slumped into his command chair, his scales drooping. There must be some way to neutralize this threat, some chink in their armor. Perhaps we escalate further, sir, another officer suggested, albeit hesitantly. Deploy our mindbreaker artillery. No living being can withstand a psychic onslaught of that magnitude. With grim resolve, Bralvis agreed. Their fleet mobilized to intercept the next known human incursion. This time, they would unleash the devastating mindbreaker. Victory through mental subjugation. No tricks, no theatrics. Just pure, overwhelming force. As the Zhilari fleet converged around a remote outpost, human and allied forces stood their ground, waiting. Aboard the human flagship, Captain Elias Forde was reviewing the Zhilari movements on the holographic display. His expression was thoughtful. So, mindbreaker artillery. Nasty stuff, right? His second in command, a cybernetically enhanced Vershi named Zhilari, nodded. Nasty is an understatement. It fractures mental coherence. How are you this calm? Elias took a bite of what appeared to be dehydrated fruit and shrugged. I've been thinking about their tactics. They'll fire everything at once to break our spirits. Yes, and the inevitable response, Zhilari pressed, clearly worried. We don't let it break us. Instead, we roll with it, Elias said, popping another piece of fruit into his mouth. Deploy the wellness pods. Zhilari tilted her head. The what? Those meditation chambers I set up during downtime. Turns out regular exposure builds mental resilience. Oh, and it helps if there's soothing music and an aromatherapy component. You know Zen stuff. Zhilari stared in disbelief. You've been running mental conditioning against a superweapon as stress relief. Elias grinned. Humans adapt, Zhilari. It's a whole thing. The Zhilari unleashed the mindbreaker artillery with ruthless precision. A psychic wave of unimaginable intensity rippled across the battlefield. And for a brief moment, it seemed like victory was assured for the Zhilari. Then, unexpectedly, the human comms channels crackled with calm breathing exercises. Inhale. Exhale. You're in your safe space, Elias's voice guided, completely serene. His troops, scattered across battle positions, assumed relaxed poses and meditated. As the psychic waves crashed against their minds, they bent but did not break. The Zhilari watched in abject horror as humans used the overwhelming attack as a form of collective stress management. A few minutes later, Alliance forces charged back, invigorated and focused, while the exhausted Zhilari troops stumbled in confusion, their mental energies drained. It was not merely a defeat, it was a statement. The Zhilari War Council scrambled to re-strategize, but by now Elias Forde's reputation had taken on mythic proportions. He was not just an adversary, he was a force of bewildering, adaptable chaos. In one of their most desperate moves, the Zhilari attempted biological warfare, releasing a plague tailored to decimate human physiology. As the pathogen swept through human ranks, Elias called an emergency meeting, his face calm but resolute. "Here's the thing about humans," he began, leaning over the table. "We've been getting sick and surviving it for millennia. Adaptation is kind of our forte. So our response is unconventional." The room grew silent. "We'll expose ourselves in controlled waves," Elias said, to stun looks from his officers. "Quarantine zones with rotating cycles. Our immune systems will learn faster than theirs can mutate. Then we weaponize antibodies." By the end of the campaign, humans not only overcame the plague but reverse-engineered cures, using them to win over populations oppressed by Zhilari influence. Even Bralvis had to admit, grudgingly, that what began as a biological nightmare ended with humans hosting celebratory bake sales and vaccination parties. The war dragged on, but the Zhilari grew wary. They tried sabotage, only for humans to adapt their defenses into elaborate counter-traps involving decoy logistics bases. They tried psychological manipulation, but Elias and his team turned it into comedy skits that boosted morale. When they resorted to brute force assaults, humans staged faux surrenders, booby-trapped their own defeat, and returned with even more improbable tactics like using gravitational waves to create localized surfing contests in the midst of combat zones. It wasn't that humans couldn't be beaten, Bralvis realized, sinking deeper into despair. It was that every victory they achieved came with a reminder humans didn't just want to win. They wanted you to remember why starting a war with them was the worst mistake you'd ever make. In the final clash, as Zhilari forces prepared for what they believed would be the decisive battle, Elias invited Bralvis to a parley. When they met on the charred remains of Corrales IV's wastelands, Elias simply poured 2 cups of tea and extended one to Bralvis. "You win," Bralvis rasped, defeated, trembling with exhaustion. "We surrender." Elias smiled, but it wasn't a victory grin. "War isn't about winners and losers, Bralvis. It's about making sure we never have to do this again. Are you ready to talk peace?" Thus the Zhilari's aggression ceased. It wasn't that humans outgunned them or outnumbered them. It was that every battle turned into a spectacle of ingenious absurdity, unpredictable resilience, and relentless reminders of how much they never wanted to face humans again. With the Zhilari formally capitulating, a fragile but promising peace spread through the galaxy. Captain Elias Forde stood atop a platform, addressing a mixed gathering of diplomats, former enemy commanders, and countless species whose lives had been shaped by the conflict. He raised a glass, his easy smile masking the weight of the years spent at the front lines. "Here's to never fighting again," Elias said, and the assembled crowd laughed nervously, knowing full well that behind his toast lay countless tales of absurdity, terror, and uncanny human improvisation that none of them wished to repeat. The human way of war had left an indelible mark. The peace conference was far from smooth. Many factions still bore grudges, and resentment simmered just beneath the surface. The Zhilari, in particular, remained wary, their scales twitching at even the sight of human delegation members. Bralvis himself felt the familiar, unsettling churn of nerves whenever he glanced in Elias's direction. Yet Elias's approach to peace was as unconventional as his approach to battle. When tensions flared during negotiations over resource allocation, he proposed a cooking contest pitting human cuisine against Zhilari and other species' dishes. The contest was a chaotic blend of alien flavors, bewildering fusion food, and one memorable incident involving a spice so potent it triggered hallucinations across half the diplomatic assembly. To his astonishment, Bralvis found himself laughing as Elias and a scarred diplomat collaborated to transform the offending spice into a harmless dessert topping. The sight of mortal enemies sharing a culinary disaster eased tensions more than any formal treaty could. Elias said to Bralvis between bites. Peace is about finding common ground, even if that ground is scorched by your latest chili pepper catastrophe. Of course, not everyone was ready to embrace peace. Rogue elements from the Zhilari military, those who couldn't stomach their leaders' surrender, banded together, planning one final strike. They called themselves the Oblivion Claws, dedicated to rekindling the war. Elias received word of their plot during a game of what humans called laser tag diplomacy, where rival factions navigated an abandoned ship repurposed for non-lethal skirmishes to simulate battlefield strategy. The irony of learning about a real rebellion while leading an exercise intended to foster trust wasn't lost on him. "Just another Tuesday," Elias muttered, immediately setting his counterplot into motion. The Oblivion Claws prepared their assault in a hidden base on the uninhabited world of Korthal. They expected human forces to mount a conventional attack or to deploy their infamous psychological tricks. But when they readied their defenses and awaited the impending storm, they were met with silence until the sky darkened and a hail of glowing spheres rained down from orbit. "Sir," a rebel operative called out. "They're using plasma." "No. Wait, are those?" The glowing spheres exploded on impact, but not with force or heat. Instead, brilliant bursts of light filled the atmosphere, projecting images of Elias Forde himself. He delivered a pre-recorded speech, surrounded by floating captions and cheerful animations. "Greetings, would-be destroyers of peace," Elias's voice boomed, echoing across the land. "I have a quick question. Why go back to war when there are so many board games you haven't played? Oh, and by the way, your defensive emplacements. Rigged for a harmless but humiliating pie launcher prank. Enjoy." The Oblivion Claws looked around in confusion as their weapon systems malfunctioned and launched compressed, harmless gelatin pies. It was absurd, yes, but also a reminder of what humans could do. The rebellion collapsed not through force but through relentless bewilderment. Exhausted, embarrassed, and thoroughly outmaneuvered, they turned themselves in, muttering that they'd had enough of human nonsense. As the dust settled and the galaxy leaned ever so slightly towards stability, Elias knew his work wasn't done. Peace had to be maintained, and if that meant keeping potential conflicts at bay by reminding everyone that war with humans was as illogical as it was terrifying, so be it. One evening, Elias found himself on a balcony overlooking the galactic capital skyline, sipping a strong human brew. Bralvis approached, his scales shimmering under the city's artificial light. "I've been thinking," Bralvis began hesitantly. "You could have crushed us." Elias tilted his head, curious, probably. But what would that have achieved? More enemies? More hatred? Bralvis let out a sigh, a rare gesture for his kind. "So you chose to make us fear ever fighting you again." "Partially," Elias admitted. "But it's more than that. We wanted you to see that peace is the better path. If you're laughing, if you're confused, if you're too tired of our antics to lift a weapon, then maybe, just maybe, we all have a chance." The two stood in silence for a while, staring into the distance. "I'll never understand humans," Bralvis finally said. Elias grinned. "I think that's the point." In the years that followed, human-led peace initiatives combined theater, diplomacy, and a baffling array of strategies meant to deter war through sheer exhaustion of the spirit. They didn't merely rely on strength, they relied on making conflict too exhausting, too absurd, and too counterproductive to pursue. No species wanted to test humanity again. And so Captain Elias Forde's legacy endured not as a warlord, but as a master of turning battlefields into stages for ridiculous brilliance. Through humor, adaptability, and relentless unpredictability, humanity became the galaxy's greatest peacemakers by making sure no one ever wanted to start a fight again.